My name is Emer Rowan McAteer. I'm a second year PhD student here in the School of Nursing in Queen's University Belfast. And I'm here with Judith Gillespie to interview her about women in leadership for International Women's Day. Judith was the first woman to be appointed as Deputy Chief Constable. She's a former member of the RUC and the PSNI. So thank you, Judith, for coming today.
Thank you, Emer.
First of all, what or who inspired you to pursue a career in policing?
Well, actually, there's no history of policing in my family, and unlike many other RUC officers who joined around the time that I joined, lots of them had fathers, brothers, uncles or whatever in the RUC, and there really wasn't any close family history for me. So when I applied to join the police, my parents were actually horrified and actively discouraged me from it. My father was a Presbyterian minister, and he was always involved in community initiatives and always got involved with cross-community projects, and was also very interested in local crime in the area, and would have chased young fellows who were breaking into the church or who were vandalising local telephone boxes or whatever. He would have rolled up his sleeves and got involved in that, and that always really impressed me. So I suppose from an early age I was very conscious that you have a social responsibility. It wasn't for any political reasons, even though at the time, 1982, when I joined, obviously there was a very sensitive political context and very divided opinions about the RUC, but none of that was really in my mind. I just joined to be a police officer and to do good in my community, and I know that sounds a bit trite, but in my naivety, that's the way it was. And at 19 years old, I look back and I think I probably was very naive when I joined.
What barriers, or any, did you come across any barriers when you were joining, and how did you overcome those?
Well, do you know what? My then boyfriend and now husband applied to join the RUC at the same time as me, and he didn't have as good O and A levels as me, and he got in his first application, and I was turned down twice. And 32 years later, I'm still not over that. So, yeah, I felt very annoyed and upset about being turned down. And of course, in those days, women in the police, believe it or not, didn't carry firearms, even though it was the height of the troubles here in Northern Ireland. Women weren't armed. We didn't even get issued with a baton. So when the men were doing their firearms training and baton training, women were issued with a handbag. Can you believe that? So it was just a totally alien world, I suppose. When I look back on it now, it's laughable, really. But that's the way the culture of the organisation was. There was this kind of paternalistic attitude towards women, that they needed to be kept out of the front line and protected. And it was only in 1994 that women were armed. And that's really very recent history. You know, that's in your lifetime. So when you look back and see those physical barriers to equality that women had to deal with, that was really the last physical barrier that was removed, and it was only removed in 1994. So you ask how I overcome those barriers. Sheer determination and a little bit of bloody-mindedness sometimes. I'm one of those people, when you tell me that you can't do something, it makes you more determined to do it, especially when the reasons for not doing it seem unjust or unfair. So I have a great sense of injustice in my heart, and that's, I suppose, what really drives me, and what drives me around gender equality as well.
Well, I suppose that kind of leads on nicely to what did you feel you had to sacrifice anything for your career, and that's something that's consistently brought up in terms of women progressing, and it's like, what do you choose? Do you choose to be a partner and a wife or a mother versus a career, and does it even have to be a choice? Should there have to be a choice?
When people ask me about sacrifices, I always think about my children, my two daughters, and I know when they were small that my husband and I were under a lot of stress. He was also a police officer, and we both worked shifts. So we worked opposite shifts, so he would have worked his week of night duty and then I would have worked my week of night duty. So for 2 weeks out of every 4, we weren't even sharing a bedroom. That's perhaps too much information, but you know, these things do put a strain on a relationship, and those were very, very tough times. But the upside of it was, for our children, that always their mum or their dad was usually looking after them. That was fine until there were crises at work. So, for example, some major crime or some incident would have happened towards the end of a shift, and he was held on at short notice, and I was obviously sitting at home waiting for him to come home to let me get away to work. And so that was incredibly stressful. And, every day that we were working back-to-back shifts, we were stressed out. And I look back on those times and think, I don't know how we got through it. For 3 years, we worked like that, and it was really, really tough. And the organisation really made very little allowance or accommodation for that. You were expected just to get on with it. In those days, there was no such thing as job sharing or part-time working or term time. It was all or nothing for me as a woman in the organisation. So I had a lot of sacrifices to make around missing things that the girls were doing at home. And I know, especially during the summer, all the family outings, and I was working, and I used to really hate that, missing out on all of that, and I would see the photographs and whatnot. I think it would probably be even worse now that you have WhatsApp and Facebook and Twitter, that you'd be seeing all these lovely photographs of your kids in these fantastic outings, and you wouldn't be part of it, but at least I was spared that because social media wasn't around in those days. But yeah, a lot of sacrifices around time with the children. But all of that said, they got fantastic experiences because I had the opportunity to go to spend some time with Ontario Provincial Police in Canada. And I brought my husband and children came with me, and they had a fantastic time in Ontario. So it did have its compensations. But I think it's really important for a woman like me to make a very strong stand about certain things that are non-negotiable in family life. So, for example, school prize days and sports days and the Christmas nativity play or whatever, those always went into my diary first, and those were not negotiable. And unless there was an absolute crisis, I mean, we all accept if there's a real crisis that it's all hands to the pump. But that kind of, in my position, gave others permission to do the same. Lower ranking officers and staff who saw, well, if the Deputy Chief Constable can take an afternoon off to go to her daughter's prize giving, then it's okay for me to do it too. And I think that's symbolically incredibly important.
I'm just conscious as you're talking there, I would probably never have asked your husband how he managed with his 2 children as he progressed.
Yes. Well, that's an aspect of life that he sometimes resents a little bit, because he's been as much of the upbringing of our 2 children as I have, and without his help, I couldn't have got to the position that I've got in. So he was amazingly helpful, So, and a great cook too.
Well, helpful. So you said earlier that there weren't schemes like the term time hours or the part time. Do you think institutions, I suppose we're thinking from the university perspective, that Queen's or the School of Nursing could be doing to be supporting women to get to those higher positions in institutions?
Well, in the police, we often look on nursing as an exemplar of good practice, because like policing, it has 24/7 responsibilities, but unlike policing, it is staffed mainly by women, and yet they seem to be able to balance flexible working, term time working, all those things that have only really in the last few years been introduced into PSNI. There are still a lot of cultural barriers to flexible working. There is quite a set shift pattern within the PSNI, and anybody who works outside of that is almost seen as a problem rather than a solution. So I can remember when I was, I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but I can remember when I was a chief superintendent, and there were 3 women in my area of responsibility who were all off on sick leave, having had babies. And the problem was that they couldn't come back and work the pattern of shifts that was on offer to them, and they wanted some flexibility. Now, my predecessor had been very clear that he wasn't going to give them any flexibility. It was those shifts or nothing. And I said to them, look, each individually, I said, tell me what you can work, and let's try and match what you can work against the needs of the organisation, because flexible working requires flexibility on both sides, not just the organisation. The woman coming back to work or the man coming back to work needs to be flexible as well. So, as I'm sure you would understand, the PSNI's peak times of demand are Friday and Saturday nights between about 8 p.m. and 4 a.m. And, 2 of those women said, well, I can work that sort of shift, but it's outside the normal shift pattern. And so we designed a shift pattern to suit them. So it was meeting their needs and the needs of the organisation. And we got them back to work, which was a far better situation than having them off at home on sick leave. So you weren't getting any working hours out of them, and they were also becoming more and more detached from the organisation. And it's my experience that the longer you stay off on sick leave and away from the organisation, the less likely you are to come back, and that would have been a huge loss. So with a little bit of flexibility on both sides, it was a problem that we solved. So your question was about could nursing do more? I'm not so familiar with the world of nursing, but I know in a 24/7 emergency service, there just needs to be some understanding of when the peaks and troughs and demands are, and trying to match your resources to those peaks and troughs, but not in a limited way that you're set by a certain shift pattern. There needs to be give and take on both sides.
What message would you give to junior women, I suppose, like me, that want to rise up, to move up the ranks, and also still maybe consider about the work-life balance? If you have children, if you want to pursue other things, and yet still not be held back because you're a woman.
If I knew 20 years ago what I know now, I guess there's a few things I might have done a little differently. I think it's fantastic now that women like you have a choice in terms of working less hours or working compressed hours or term time or whatever. I think that is great. But I still think, I feel very strongly that organisations view women who take those sorts of facilities as somehow less committed or maybe less career-minded. And that's a real shame, because it's a very short-term issue. It may be that until your children start school or until they start secondary school, that you'll want for a few years to work a little fewer hours, but very quickly you'll be back to working full-time and full commitment again. And what is often the case is that women who work reduced hours end up working a full-time job in reduced hours. So they're working twice as hard as everybody else, but not given the credit for that commitment. Or the pay, indeed. And you're absolutely right. And the big pay differential comes in those child-rearing years in the sort of late 20s and early 30s typically, but it's not always that, of course. Where the pay differential, the pay gap between women and men widens. Up until that point, it's very similar. But then when women step off the career carousel for a few years and take reduced pay, then it's very hard to get back up into the same pay level as their male colleagues. And that's a big, big challenge that needs to be addressed. And I just find it very irritating, the way some women are viewed. Oh, she's in part-time, or she's flex, or she's in term time, as if somehow she owes something to the organisation for taking that time off. Well, she's entitled to these facilities by law, as, by the way, are men. It's not just women who avail of these facilities. Men can too, especially those with perhaps caring responsibilities for older parents. So these sorts of facilities benefit everyone, and in the longer run, you keep the experienced staff in your organisation and you make them feel valued, and that's the way it ought to be.
So do you think things like the Gender Initiative and Athena Swan are helping to bridge that gap, that sort of when you're getting into your late 20s, the difference between men and women's career progression?
I remember when PSNI was drafting their very first gender action plan in 2003, 2004, that we learnt a lot from Queen's, because they were one of the very first organisations in Northern Ireland to have a gender plan. So we very much tried to emulate what you'd done in Queen's, and it was Yvonne Galligan who was, I think, instrumental in that at the time, and she was a big help to us in formulating our gender action plan. So I think, first of all, recognising that there is an issue, because not everyone acknowledges now, with all the equality legislation that's in place and with visible women leaders in Northern Ireland society, they would say, well, sure, what's the problem now? Why do we need an International Women's Day? Well, hello, things are far from perfect at the moment. Just over 20% of our MLAs are female, so we've still a long way to go. 27% of our police service is female, still a long way to go. We've got a female First Minister, that's great, but it's important to make sure that the momentum has kept going, and I think gender action plans, International Women's Day, initiatives like that keep the focus on what is still a major problem.
Okay, if you could change one thing about the culture for women in professional life, what would it be? It's your magic wand question.
I think one of the biggest challenges is gender stereotyping. I think it happens in every walk of life. It happens in the media. It happens in careers. It happens in schools. From day one, little girls are bought pink, fluffy, girly toys, and boys are bought action, science-oriented toys. So almost from the moment that your child is sitting up and taking notice of what's going on, there's stereotyping going on. If I could change that, then I think we would be making real progress.